And my name is John Mancini. I'm associated with Infotechtion. Many of you probably know me from my former hat as president of AIM for over 2 decades, and now I'm connected with Infotechtion. Our webinar today is on modernizing migration and information classification with Infotechtion, and that is kind of a mouthful. So let me just kind of like break it down in terms of what we're going to talk about. And we have 3 speakers, so I will be mercifully quick in my introductions, and I can already hear the applause going up that we will hop into this thing pretty quickly. So our focus is going to be on how to use Azure Auto Classification approaches for finding information of value and for accelerated migration to the cloud. And so I was thinking about this before we got started, and as I mentioned, I spent a number of years doing a lot of the market research for AIM, and some data points came back to me as I was thinking about that, just in terms of introduction. And so there's 5 of them I just wanted to rattle off before we got started. The first is that I used to survey people all the time, and I would ask them 2 pretty simple questions. I would ask the question of, okay, over the next 2 to 3 years, if the current volume of information coming into your organization is X, what do you expect it to be in 2 to 3 years? And the answer would almost always come back something between 3.5 and 4x. So a dramatic increase in the volume of information. I would also say, what kind of information is this? Is it structured? Is it semi-structured? Is it totally unstructured? What is it? And people would say, on average, again, it would almost always come back pretty predictable, about 60% unstructured or semi-structured. So the originating points, in addition, are becoming more complex as a result of COVID remote work. So that's a whole nother set of issues that people have had to address. And then the last 2 data points that occurred to me were relevant to this discussion is that I asked people a couple of years ago about this question of migrating content and data from legacy systems into more modern systems. And 60% of the organizations I spoke with said that this was a significant problem and challenge for them. And then lastly, I asked a question at the time, it's probably gotten a little better since then, of how many of them were using AI and machine learning tools in widespread use. And that came back only about 15%. So the tools that we're going to talk about today are really very critical to this problem of information chaos that organizations are struggling with right now. And I'm really excited about this approach. I've gotten a little preview on how it's all going to work. So I think you're really going to enjoy this. And our 3 speakers are Brian Tumler, who's the COO at Infotechtion, Natalie Noonan, who's a global black belt at Microsoft, and Vivek Bhatt, who's the CTO at Infotechtion. When each of you start, I would like to ask you, just give everybody 10, 15 seconds, any additional bio that you'd like to cover. And I believe, Brian, you're the first speaker. Am I right or wrong?
That is true.
So take it away, Brian.
Awesome, thank you. And also, for what it's worth, Natalie and I are going to have more of a conversation than necessarily a set of separate slides that we go separately through. So both of us will be part of this process, and I'll let Natalie introduce herself when we get to the first question that relates to where she is participating on this. I have been consulting since 1991. Almost every client that we've ever worked with has some sort of very large data problem, unstructured content. In the old days, it was how to get stuff out of a file room into an imaging system. A lot of times recently, it's how to get stuff out of some sort of legacy ECM system into the cloud, or a shared drive into the cloud. We're going to be focusing a lot on the content that we find on shared drives today. And actually, the bigger picture that from this is, how do you get to the point of trying to transform an entire shared drive so that you could decommission it if you needed to? It's a huge task because there's a lot of things other than auto classification. We're going to touch on some of those. We really want to focus on the auto classification stuff because that's really the part where you're replacing a human decision of yes, no, and where with some intelligence that's repeatable, so that you're not just relying on, did they put it into the right folder, and therefore did it get the right tags to move forward. So it's a lot more than just putting it into a folder and figuring out where to go forward. Before I get too far, I just real quick introduction about Infotechtion. Relatively new company, a couple years old, but our 3 founders, if you combined all their ages and their experience in this industry, it equals about a couple thousand years, something like that. I forget. It's a large number. We have offices in the United States, the UK, Netherlands, Norway, and actually we've just opened up an office in India. So we are Microsoft partners, spend a lot of time with Microsoft. Our primary focus, actually I'll get to this in a second. You can see this, I'll let you read this when you want, but that's who we are as a company. Spending a lot of time figuring out, mostly focused on the M365 space. So what that means is information governance, because we're primarily focused on the stuff that is related to the information governance capabilities with M365. Obviously, that relates back to how are you going to classify and organize stuff going into it. So that's why that relates back to the subject matter. Our services include a lot of the pre-system strategic planning on how you do an M365 implementation. How do you develop an information governance use case strategy with use cases, including a vision, the various success factors, the KPIs, the roadmaps, and all the strategic level stuff. The architectures that go into that and what bits and pieces need to be defined for your M365 space. And then the very specific solutions along the way of applying these types of classifications and various bits and pieces. So all in all, our goal in a lot of these discussions is to remain within the M365 Microsoft stack of capabilities, which is really why we wanted Natalie to be here and contribute to these discussions, which you'll see in just a second. The big story in all of this is you're moving to the cloud. What does that provide you? And it's not just a replication of all the services that you've always had on the platform. It's now all of these silos that you used to have because of this limitations of on-premise type applications that you see above the line. You're now able to expand that down below the line and connect things on the back end between Azure, between the various M365 capabilities and all the classification bits and pieces that fit into there. So I'm going to sort of pass this over to Natalie right now. See how does this fit, and what are you seeing at Microsoft with this?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I think what I tend to see from a lot of our customers when they're coming to look at the M365 capabilities, or maybe we're just we're also seeing this as we receive RFIs and so on, that customers are really trying to build out this kind of an end state of a very holistic vision for compliance, and they're wanting to build in their good governance strategies as they move to the cloud. So like John was mentioning, they're really painfully aware that they're producing more and more data every year. They're having a lot of challenges with this fragmented portfolio of tools, siloed systems, these volumes of legacy data, their shared drives and so on. And so they're not just necessarily looking at M365 and how they manage that data going forward, but to John's point earlier, they're also trying to look at like how do they solve for their legacy data, and in some cases their on-premise environments are also they're going out of date, they're aging, they're no longer being maintained and updated. So they're really trying to figure out, and from an architecture perspective, or they're being forced to kind of fundamentally rethink how they're going to manage their data going forward. How can they do it more efficiently? How are they going to leverage automation to be able to classify, retain, protect, and delete in a compliant manner? And really, from a regulatory perspective, they're being, assessed against their ability to do that. They must make these changes. So that's I think a lot of the kind of goals that they're trying to build in to both build in the good go forward process and also manage that look back over all of these different data environments.
Thank you. Yeah. To provide a little bit of background of migrations, obviously there's a lot of migrations out there. Legacy content systems have been there. Legacy records management systems are there. It's a combination of data and structure. And so a lot of times if the information's there, it makes it easier to do a fairly straightforward lift and shift. We obviously along the way, if there's things that have been left out along the ways, along the migration paths in the past, we can fix those things. And that's kind of what we want to focus on here. So we've highlighted the biggest changes since 2013 and 2019, but you'll also notice on file shares, the fifth one down, that's still a huge number. People are still very much migrating content from file shares, which is our ungoverned locations and very poorly managed, very poorly organized generally. And how do you map that on? How do you make that something that you move forward with? So that's kind of why we wanted to focus on this. Just a quick data point. Obviously, this comes from all the work that John Mancini's been doing at AIM. That's our source for this content. What we've seen in the past are these three different migration approaches. The first one is the traditional one that we've seen in a lot of older systems. You do a system inventory where you allow people to then do their cleanup and their classification, which is very often ugly things like an Excel spreadsheet where they have to put in the records category, whatever classification they need to. And then you build a manifest and you load that data into your system, and then you can apply governance with that. The second accelerated one with a system inventory, you move everything all at once, and then once it's in the system, you can then allow the business to do that classification. It allows a little more flexibility. It's a little bit faster, and in some cases, it cuts down the amount of time that you need to worry about on that migration process. But really, what we want to talk about is this intelligent transformation, where you do your system inventory. You don't have to move everything. It's a good idea to filter out some of it because there's a movement issue involved with large volumes of content. If you had to move a petabyte of content, it'll take you quite a long time to get through that. And by that, I mean much more than a weekend, much more than a month. So, into the years, possibly. But we want to AI lead this classification, and then we move it into the governed locations. We can also continue to add classifications after it. And the other big message about what you're about to see is, once this is in place, then it continues to be there. So if you've built the intelligence to take a piece of content and put it into the right folders and the right classifications and structures, anytime in the future you put a new piece of content in, a lot of those same rules will still apply. If you've got the ability, for example, in your Azure pipeline to OCR content, if you add in a new piece of content, it can get OCR'd as part of that process. So it's not just a once and done kind of project, it's an ongoing forever kind of project. Comparing those three different methods, the traditional one really depends very highly on the business being available to do the classification in the Excel spreadsheets to decide what to keep, what to throw away, what to do. It really is subject to their business availability, can take quite a long time. Obviously, these months are relative to each other as opposed to total duration. You might find migration projects still taking years and years and years to get through. The governance accuracy tends to be high because you've had a human being looking at it, but the costs are also very high. With the accelerated approach, obviously it's high on the business dependency, it goes faster. Your accuracy goes down because you're relying a little bit more on post-migration classification. You might have lost some metadata along the way. The costs are pretty low in that perspective. When you're doing what we're suggesting here with the intelligent migration, the business dependency is much lower. You still need to work with the businesses to understand the goals and the rules to define and classify content, but you're building them in to be applied consistently across all the data once it comes in. So the speed is much faster. The governance accuracy is really pretty high. It allows for clarifications and modifications after you're done. And the costs are really just associated with the cost of the Azure capabilities and tools, usually on a per transaction basis, but we can talk about that. Yeah. So the important thing about the governance classification bit is in those traditional methods, generally, if you're doing a compliance or a classification across content, you generally will address one of these or possibly two of these. But the idea is that the business in that spreadsheet that they're filling out, trying to map things to a classification, they're doing it from a records management perspective. To have them also do it from a privacy perspective or an information security or IT infrastructure makes it a little more difficult. And so this allows you to build up that kind of rule set where you can actually apply the necessary extractions and classifications to address all of these different participants in this. Natalie, tell me a little bit about what you're seeing from Microsoft's perspective on having this governance perspective.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, one thing that is critical here that I think we're showing all these different perspectives, what different stakeholders are really trying to solve for, and it's critical that we are engaging these different areas to understand what their requirements are. We don't want to solve for this in a silo and only solve the records management requirements, we really need to have the buy-in of the different parties so that we're building a coordinated effort to build in governance and agree on the different classification strategies and have these work together. So, for example, like if we're working with legal, they need to understand how we're approaching classification and be able to speak to the defensibility of the process, how we're deciding to dispose of content so that we can move less rather than more data. We need to understand what the active litigation matters are and how legal holds apply, and be able to build that into the process so that we can get to the kind of disposition, appropriate disposition process. Of course, from the records management team perspective, we're going to have to kind of understand as we look at the retention schedule, what's the appropriate way to go about building these auto classification rules that really are in alignment with our records retention schedule and records categories, because we're not just doing this one time from a look back perspective, but we're trying to apply that on an ongoing basis in our go forward processes. From privacy, of course, we want to take that into consideration as well and be working together from records management and privacy together, understanding what is an appropriate way to dispose of content that's both mindful of our privacy requirements and our need to dispose of data once we no longer have an obligation to retain it. But the two really have to be coming at that together. So, how do we build those types of requirements in? And then ultimately from the security and IT perspective, understand how are we identifying sensitive data, aligning with our data classification policies, and, imagine from a records management perspective, we're really identifying what that content is by being able to apply the retention categories. So, being able to use that to inform how do we appropriately protect that data, apply data loss prevention policies around it, and so on and so forth. So, there's really a better together story about bringing these stakeholders together and being able to champion these efforts together, so that there's a combined vision and really working towards getting the best use and achieving that better together story across M365 compliance. So I think it's a bit of a shift, I think, that happens as you're moving into like M365 and understanding how all of these compliance capabilities are really built to work together. And I think it's starting some new conversations that maybe hadn't that weren't always being had in the past. So yeah, so that's kind of exciting.
That's great. Yeah, one of the things that I've noticed in doing from the very early projects that I started doing in auto classification tended to be run based on silos. So it would be somebody only looking for privacy compliance issues, or only looking for records, or only looking for litigation. And when you get to the understanding that you've got all of this information in a single location where you can actually look at it from all of those perspectives, you kind of go, oh, we've wasted an opportunity if we don't include all these things and have them work all together.
Yeah.
So in the slides that come up, you'll see each of these columns represented at different places, and then you'll see each of the boxes represented by the types of capabilities that are in the Azure pipeline and in the M365 classification space, and how we want to sort of leverage them all together. This is not an exhaustive list, but just the types of things that you might find for privacy compliance, finding personally identifiable information, for example. So all of these you'll see coming up in the slides ahead, and this is how they sort of all tie together on that. I'm going to start real quickly with what you're likely to find if you decide you need to decommission a shared drive, a large common shared drive in a Fortune 100 company, which is where these stats pretty much come from. You can see there, we can classify things into a bunch of different levels. Some of these classifications can be done at the file level, file analysis level, before you migrate stuff to Azure. And so we'll talk about that real briefly. But just to run through the circle, just so you can see, There's stuff that's found on shared drives that really cannot exist in the cloud, and that's what the bottom one is. So we want to optimize those things. It's structured data, where if you just move the database table, it's not going to function when it's in the cloud. You need to optimize it by migrating it or reconstructing it or rebuilding it. Systems and applications and multimedia tend to be the kinds of things that you really sort of need to decide. They're big and heavy and important and live, but do they exist in the Azure? And is there anything about them that it would be useful from a content analytics auto classification type capability? Moving around to the left, there's the stuff on the remove bucket, which is the garbage, the traditional garbage classifications, duplicates, non-business values, stuff that's been replaced and abandoned, stuff that you can identify without necessarily needing to go through content analytics to decide what it is. Some stuff at the top that really should be considered not stuff that you want to move, but you really do want to eventually move it. So web content, things like training programs, website, web content, and then content templates are very valuable things to have in the cloud, but you don't want to just move them. You want to be a little more careful about how those things are moved. The stuff on the right tends to be about 40%. It's the stuff that has content, and there's no reason to go through content analytics on the stuff where there is no content. So that's really the goal of what this slide is trying to get to. We're next going to move to just the stuff that we want to migrate. You'll find collaborative stuff and static stuff in that collection. We're going to move, and basically this is the approach that you work with the business to understand this. First is of that collaborative static actual content, where there is content, you've got stuff that the business will say, we know ahead of time that this is important stuff. There's also the stuff that you just know is active, so it's important not because the business says it is, but because it's recent active content. And then there's stuff that the business doesn't know what it is, and it may be past its prime, but it's still important information. And so each of those things has different characteristics about it that we want to throw through this metadata enhancement in the middle of the cognitive services in our approach. So you can see the various checks that are there. We're going to check for litigation, check for personal data, and check for records on the content that the business doesn't know. On the stuff that they do know, that they want to claim, you can use the same techniques and capabilities to add value to that metadata so that when it gets moved, it gets the right labels attached, the right metadata attached, and the right protection labels, whatever that happens to be, into a place on SharePoint Online where that can be managed and controlled and governed appropriately. For the stuff that the business doesn't know what it is, you still want to do a litigation check, a personal data check, and a records management check. They may not remember that they've got this content, but that content is there. So you can still check for that stuff. So the very top row says, we know we want to, let's check and see what needs to be classified. The bottom stuff says, we don't know what's in it. Let's make sure we examine that and see what kind of issues, what kind of risks, what kind of records we need to worry about in that process. And if that doesn't need to be captured and labeled and protected, we can put it into an Azure Online archive. So in that whole process, we've gotten rid of garbage. We've optimized the databases and applications. We've now taken the claimed active stuff and the unclaimed stuff. We've done our appropriate checks on it. We've done our appropriate classifications. This is as simple as I can make it on a slide. It's really much more complex than this, but a high-level view to get you to a holistic approach to all of the data that you might find on a shared drive. Once it's all in its place and you've managed all that stuff, then you can get to the point of considering shutting down shared drives, shutting down servers, and saving the money from the maintenance that is applied there. High-level principles I just want to throw through. The business needs to have the opportunity to identify the important stuff first. I think you'll get copies of these slides, so you can read them later. But the decisions to migrate or eliminate content should be based on validated rules, as opposed to having every individual go through their files and say, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. The decisions to eliminate, classify, or move should be made at a single high level of the business wherever possible. So if you can make a universal decision across the enterprise to delete content or to classify things a certain way, that saves everybody a lot of time and energy. You want to defer as many of those as you can. Don't get down to the individual levels once again. You want to get rid of stuff that you should get rid of before you need to try to classify it. So if I've got 10 copies of something, I should get rid of 9 before I run it through content analytics. So therefore, things like low value content, garbage content, the rot, get rid of that first if you can, so you don't have to run it through the cognitive services to figure out where you're going with it. Applications of the rules assume that people in the past have tried to name things intelligently. If you find an invoice that doesn't say the word invoice on it, and is not structured like an invoice, there's a bigger problem there. So we're assuming that people are going to follow certain patterns and rules and the way we classify things so that they're at least repeatable and we can figure out where to go with it. And finally, we want to work towards consistency rather than accuracy. Generally on litigation and retention management type issues, the courts are really understanding of good intentions and reasonable approaches rather than 100% accuracy. So those are some of the key principles that we want to focus on moving forward. And I think basically as a summary of this, I'm going to pass it back to Natalie and see if you have any comments on this.
Yeah, so I mean, why auto classification? I think we've mentioned a lot of the challenges and the volumes of data. We simply cannot do this in manual ways. The volumes are too high, the content is too old. The subject matter experts are probably no longer at the organization, or if they are, that's probably not our best use of those types of employees to be trying to really be engaged in the classification of these millions of documents or petabytes of data. So I think some of the things, and to kind of reiterate some of the principles that were just mentioned, in terms of that kind of faster ROI, we're going to think of the things that we can do that are the easiest first. The things like getting rid of the redundant, obsolete, trivial information. You know, can we build some of these repeatable business rules that are saying, you know, if I know it's a temporary file, backup files, corrupt files, if they're exact duplicates, or if they're super old, those are all analytics that can be surfaced and then help make the determination of the content that maybe can be is eligible for disposal or poses some risk or is at conflict with our existing, say, acceptable use policies. Maybe there's personal content that doesn't fit with our corporate policy. Maybe there's restricted content that we do not want to have in our organization, and we can easily make these decisions and get some immediate and quick wins. When we talk about using auto classification, there's this ability to immediately find where sensitive and personal information resides, and that's just surfaced and immediate to you to understand what is high risk. So I think some of those, using some of that automation, whether it's built in or something we're building ourselves to find company specific data, we're able to then make some other decisions about how to kind of triage and manage and remediate that content as well. And of course, through automation, we're also able to identify and apply retention categories. And that's further going to just help us do, as we kind of continue down the path of what's easiest to what's easily classifiable. Using automation, we have things like sensitive information types, or we can build queries based on keywords or other searchable properties, or there's the different machine learning capabilities where we can teach the system, say, what is a contract or an invoice or a purchase order, or what are engineering specifications, depending on what type of business we are. Now that we know what that looks like, go out and find and automatically label that content. And all of these things are possible and just part of this robust set of solutions that are going to let us, classify that content and be able to make decisions about that, in addition to like legal holds and all of those types of things. And ultimately, then we look at things like cost savings and so on. We're able to move less rather than more because we were able to rationalize that content in a way that we knew how long we need to retain it, and move only what's required and valuable going forward. So, huge cost savings in applying these types of analytics and using the automation and auto classification in this way during this type of process. And I think, it's just a really powerful usage of the tools that are already available to you so that you can make defensible decisions about the data. From a transparency perspective, that business rule again is being kind of being iterated on. It's being done in a consistent and repeatable manner, so we can always go back and speak to how that information was understood and how decisions were made. And then ultimately, I mean, this is going to be we're benefiting, of course, by making the information more searchable and findable and useful again to the organization. And we're going forward through this process. It's now going to be protected and governed and so on, and meet our regulatory obligations and so on. So we're in that good state of good governance going forward.
That's a nice summary. Thank you. Yes. Yeah. Real briefly, I talked about on the earlier slides with the governance slide, the different capabilities that are in this. These are some of the things that we can use that are part of this whole environment in the classification ecosystem within Microsoft. Some of the stuff resides within the Azure Cognitive Services, but we also need to rely on and pass information back and forth to the M365 content. You can see on the M365 content that we have sensitive information types, trainable classifier sensitivity labels, retention labels, syntax classifiers and extractors, and content types and metadata. A lot of that really depends upon, is that information in your unstructured content? And to get to that point is why we want to use some of the Azure content capabilities. So this list of extraction and classification capabilities on the bottom right is really some of them found in the M365 side, some on the Azure content site, but basically it's a lot of ways to figure out all the ways that humans have, in an ungoverned fashion, tried to classify and organize their content already, whether that's information that's available, easily found, or whatever. But once it gets into those things, we can start applying the policies that you see on the bottom left: data loss prevention, information governance, information protection, and that's getting back to that whole high-level governance slide that we had. In general, this is the more detailed architecture approach. Basically, it says you're going to take on the left-hand side your source system. Once again, it could be content extracted from a legacy ECM or a shared drive, moving it in bulk to your Azure file share. If you've done pre-filters, that's great. We then run it through the #2 Azure pipeline bits and pieces to extract out, open up, compress, process. None of these capabilities are really new to the world. They've been combined in this environment and in the approach that we've put together in a way that's focused on specifically unstructured content. So you'll find cognitive services out there really focused on data structures and other things that aren't necessarily the type of unstructured stuff you'd find on file shares. But once you've extracted out and enhanced all this data back to the files and in Azure Tables, you can then throw that at the decision categories that you'd find normally in an auto classification capability, such as a records management set of rules in M365. And then once that's there, you either migrate stuff if you've decided that it rises to the level of a record or collaborative content, or if it doesn't, we can delete it or archive and delete it. So there's a lot of options with what you can do with that content and the way you structure it. And that's really what we're here to help sort of figure out how to define and put together. And in the interest of time, I'm going to now pass it over to Vivek and let him talk for a while and give you a preview, a little bit about what this looks like.
Thank you. Brian, can I check if you can hear me okay?
We can hear you fine. Thank you.
Lovely. Okay, thank you. So this is, all those concepts and all those principles that you saw on the slides and you heard from John, Brian, and Natalie. What we've done is actually put together all of those into this solution called Auto Classification. And using this solution, we are able to leverage all the capabilities in Azure which already exist and more to be able to bring a consolidated view of the assessment of your information. So the traditional methods which are leveraged to analyze unstructured information in file shares is to very much collect the inventory, scans to read through the folder paths, file properties, and the most basic form of analysis that we have seen so far is the age analysis, based on which certain rules are identified certain criteria are established to understand what is the overall map of the information structure. We extend that further from the initial scans. So of course, the age analysis is really important as a building block to get into the more deep analysis of the information. This goes beyond the scanning and actually looks inside the files, inside the content of the files, and leverages a number of capabilities in Azure. For example, a number of cognitive search capabilities. We have developed custom skills in the backend to be able to apply specific rules based on certain patterns that we find or similar documents that we find to identify them as information of value or information which could potentially be important from a regulation point of view. For example, personal data or information which might need to be looked at from a GDPR point of view. So overall, what you see in the user experience is a full inventory of your folder structure, including the file structure as well. And on the right-hand side, we are able to show a summarized view. For example, in this small example, there are 23 files, but scale it up to millions of files and petabytes of data to be able to slice it into manageable chunks and display it at an appropriate level of aggregation. So the identification of files by preservation, files as records, and files as risk is all the rules that are baked into the product based on the best practices, based on the compliance frameworks you just heard from the team. And this provides the analysis on various file types, which can be indexed, not just the Office file types. The capability includes analyzing one of the most common issues that we have seen is the PSD files. It's very hard to analyze PSD files, and what's of value or what's of risk in the PSD files are the emails. And quite often we've seen that due to legacy issues and until Microsoft 365 came along and people had bigger mailboxes, it was very difficult for users to manage that information, and hence there is a whole volume of PSD files which exist in file share. So to be able to burst open those PSD files, look inside them and analyze emails and be able to identify an analysis by preservation, risk, and records, and then be able to actually move those emails and take actions on those emails rather than keeping them as PSD files. Similarly, we are also able to do zip file analysis or compressed file analysis to be able to decompress them or in other words, burst open those zip files and not just look at the name of the zip file and the size of the zip file, but based on the content which is inside the zip file, scan it, extract specific entities such as organization, person type. So organization and person type is something that we are able to automatically extract. These are existing skills which don't need any customization, and leveraging those. Similarly, the personal data templates for specific countries, not just a standard template, but for each country based on the language, and it is quite intelligent in a way that we are also able to determine the language of the document as well, and based on that, perform the analysis in the language of the document based on the rules that will be applicable to the information which is based on that particular language. If we go on to the next slide, please. You can also drill down from each one of those summary pie charts into more deeper analysis. So, for example, this is a personal data analysis based on which you see on the left-hand side a categorization of files by risk levels. Files which are perhaps include personal data, but based on the rules are no risk versus certain files which include certain type of personal data, which is a high risk content. So not all personal data is a risky information. Personal data could be useful and could be relevant to the operations that you're performing. In addition to that, you can also, of course, make the decisions at the aggregation level, but the tooling provides you an opportunity to review the files. And the review capability is quite effective in a way to not only just look at what has been extracted. For example, see in this sample dummy data, certain entities have been automatically extracted. Could be phone number, could be credit card number, and hence falls into the category of personal data. But you're also able to see a snippet of the content to be able to feel confident that the system is able to prove what it is showing. And look, if you were to look inside the content, you don't have to read pages of the document. We are able to extract a snippet where we found that particular entity and in which context that entity was found. Displaying just a bunch of numbers as credit card or phone numbers is not something might be relevant, but it is always important to understand and analyze in a relevant context. So for each file and for each information, you are able to see the content snippet and then additional information as you explore. And of course, you can open the file and analyze the file as well. Next slide, please.
I just want to throw out there that those credit cards that you see are my credit cards. So feel free to go out and buy yourselves a cup of coffee with that. If you, oh, just kidding. Go ahead.
Similarly, building on that, we also have a very very specific lens, not only just on the personal data, litigation analysis as well. Quite often we see that when information, as also Brian mentioned previously, when information is is no longer required by the business and hence can be deleted, there could still be a litigation interest. There could still be an e-discovery interest in that information. So these checks are very relevant in terms of identifying that before the information is either deleted or migrated over, is that of relevance to litigation? And hence, you can imagine that as we move the information, for example, to Microsoft 365, any information which is of, let's say, in this case, climate change interest, could be identified, and actually certain e-discovery controls can be applied. For example, if an organization is involved in an audit or a litigation related to climate change or any other topic, and that information is identified, then while we migrate, as part of the migration, that information can be clearly identified, tagged, and we can leverage the compliance capabilities within Microsoft 365 to apply litigation and e-discovery holds onto that information. Again, as you go along with the information, with each level of detail and each visualization, you do see the content. So you always have the ability to not only just see which entities have been extracted, what suggestions have been made by the system, but you can validate that very quickly by looking at the piece of the content where that particular entity was found.
As a quick caveat, this is not intended to be a full e-discovery solution. E-discovery involves much more linear review and analysis of files in depth, but really this is intended to say, wave your hands in the air and say, it looks like there's some content here that might be related to litigation. Let's let the business get back involved after they've decided that they didn't need it and say, maybe you do need to know this. Please tell us how it's related. So it's a way to communicate back to the business in an early case assessment type approach towards what that content is.
Thank you. The next is records classification, information which is required for long-term retention. And in that regard, there are pre-built classifiers which are available in Azure to identify, for example, in the healthcare industry, there are existing classifications available to be able to run those models on the data to identify information which is of relevance from a health point of view. We can leverage that. We have leveraged the similar functionality to be able to build other classifiers as well. So for example, from a legal point of view, any information which is of legal advice or legal matter, or it could be business specific information. There are pre-built classifiers which come along with it, but then further classifiers can be created based on sample documents that you provide us. Quite often I've seen is that going into the organizations, we find it very difficult because any tooling which is dependent on keywords or a dictionary businesses struggle to provide that dictionary, which can be used as a source to perform keyword search or regular expression search, and we spend quite a lot of time on it. We have solved that problem to a large extent by actually not asking the business for keywords and dictionary, but actually asking for sample documents. So if you are able to provide us for a certain category, your exemplar documents, the system is automatically able to extract key entities which it finds of relevance and be able to present it back to you, and you get the opportunity to correct it and then improve it. And then the classifier, when executed on large scale volume, is able to find similar patterns, similar matching documents. So that's actually is one of the key improvements that we have brought into this whole equation of somewhat mitigating the dependency on keywords and the business to somehow come up with good keywords and a good list of words, which will then identify what's business specific, what's knowledge specific, what is a corporate memory, and what is a record within the organization. Right. So this is a visual of how you can train the system. And so you've seen kind of the analysis which the system has shown you. And for each one of those, you can pick a selection of files for a specific category. And based on the classification and the risk category that has been identified, you can accept or reject. You can make comments about why you are accepting and why you're rejecting. And based on that, the system is able to train the classifiers again in the backend and rescan, reanalyze the information and present back to you. So this is the feedback model through which we are able to identify false positives for each one of those categories, not just for compliance categories, but also for business entity extraction. So you saw that in the first slide that we were able to show you organizational entities, other entities which are of business value. And if they are not correct entities, then you can fine tune them through this model. The other element as part of this is that quite often we find that when organizations have specific information types, which are very specific to them. So for example, if you are an engineering organization and you do a large scale projects, then often you have projects and project IDs, and they tend to have specific formats. So not only the patterns and the formats of those known information types, such as credit cards, passport numbers, etc., the same model can be leveraged to actually accept the information types which are specific to you if they follow a certain pattern. So project IDs, matter IDs, if they follow a similar nomenclature, they can also be included as custom information types, which can then be run against the model to be able to identify information and extract that as an entity as a key value pair. And then finally, it's important not just to show you the analysis and be able to train and fine tune it. At the end of it, they need to be actionable. So information which is identified as a critical risk or high risk, how should the actions be taken against those? So for example, and that's where we integrate our tooling with the Microsoft migration capabilities as well. So this tooling is not just about analyzing the information and then leveraging third-party migration tools. Of course, you can use them as well, but Microsoft has invested heavily into migration of information, and a number of their acquisitions, recent acquisitions in terms of migration, for example, Mover, etc., they are quite useful in taking the following on action. So for example, here, if you decide that certain information is to be deleted, those actions are recorded in the system. You are able to see a full-scale map across your organization, across your file share landscape, which folders have which actions, which classifications assigned to them. And then in the backend, we are able to spin up migration activities. For example, move to SharePoint for certain type of information. The migration tooling is able to read through the central repository where all the decisions have been taken, and on that basis, analyze, migrate, and distribute and classify the information in SharePoint. When the information is distributed in SharePoint Online, a key part of that is to also apply the classification. And classification is not just in the form of metadata, sensitivity labels, retention labels, all come into play because now your information has classification, and if it is identified as a record, based on that classification, automated rules can then be set up in Compliance Center to, for example, let's say, apply a confidentiality sensitivity label or a retention label. I think that kind of covers my slides. Brian, is there anything that you would like to add or maybe say about some of the capabilities that we've shown?
Yeah, so I think in summary, I'm going to surprise Natalie with another question that she doesn't know is happening, but I'm going to ask her anyway, just to see if, based on what we've gone through today, if there's anything that she wanted to include that she hasn't already said, or any final thoughts before we close up this session.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I didn't actually introduce my background when I started, and I'll just say, like, I am someone who used to be on the system development side. Over time, I ended up going into information governance based on the challenges we are seeing in our own organization with making sense of this legacy data, and essentially kind of advocated for and had to experience myself like building out information governance program from scratch. So I've had to go through these processes manually and tried to go through them manually and know those pains. And then later as a consultant, also often had this type of ask come to me from a consulting perspective. So I think one of the things that I was kind of struck by when I saw this is, wow, from a consulting perspective, I used to have to spend many, many hours just helping define what does a legacy data remediation kind of classification, defensible disposition process look like. And that would take dozens and dozens of hours to get there with our customers and get comfortable with that. Let alone then move into what tools are we going to use, assess all these different capabilities. And I think kind of one of the things that I just love and that we were often trying to achieve is that what can I do with my existing investments in Microsoft, in Azure, and how can those processes not be just point in time, but something that I can continue to reuse and apply on a go-forward basis. So I think those are some of the things that I kind of love in what I'm seeing in this approach that is really, I think, trying to make the most of your existing investments, make it simpler, and it kind of provides an approach already out of the gate, kind of eliminating some of the steps, the cost, the time that I think we typically have seen in the past. So, and those are just some reflections I have and why I was excited to see this particular kind of combination of how to use the Microsoft tools in ways that made sense to me. So yeah, there's just some comments there. Curious what others have to say and what if there's any other questions from the
thank you, Natalie.
Joining.
I'll just one of the things just to tie this up to me, that one of the things that's been really exciting about this also, and you sort of said this, but we referred to it earlier, is that each of the individual components here, a regular expression, a proximity search, training classifier, are all technologies and techniques and capabilities that are mature and understandable, and people have an experience and knowledge of how to use them. It's the only thing that's really new here is combining them all into a specific use case and function in a singular location. And like you said, it's on the Microsoft stack, so it's known and trusted and credible and believable moving forward with it. And that's really the thing that I think is nice altogether. So John, I'm going to hand it back to you to wrap this up.
Great.
Can I just make one quick point? Just one very important point is that all of this is something that can be installed within your Microsoft 365 and Azure environment. So as part of this analysis, no data is actually going out of your Azure subscription or Microsoft 365 subscription, which is a really good value. And I see a lot of the times toolings and products actually get caught up in the information risk management and so information security management situations. So just a quick one. Sorry, John.
I think just wrapping up, three things that really occurred to me during the course of the conversation was, first of all, was Brian, your slide on the I guess I would call it the different silos or personas or criteria that are used to evaluate migration kinds of decisions, and legal and RIM and privacy and security and IT and all of that. And I think thinking about those in a much more holistic way than we've traditionally done becomes so important when the scale and complexity goes up. And if you don't do that, you're just going to wind up being back, at the starting point again pretty quickly, because you won't have reflected the true complexity, and particularly as compliance laws and everything else get more and more complex over time. Second one was the chart when we talked about the 3 different approaches, and the more traditional approaches have such a high degree of business dependency. That's one that sets off for me one of those red flags, because nobody likes business dependency in any kind of records or governance situation, because nobody likes to do it. I mean, and to the extent that you can mitigate that, that's really good. And then the other part, which really got, and it reminded me a little bit, I'm a big fan of the Field of Dreams movie, like if you build it, he will come. I love your quote about once you build it, it will always be there. And I think that's a really important thing. You're thinking about how to create automated processes that not only have value at a particular point in time, but have a value in time moving forward. Because once you do it, as you said, you've got it. So thank you guys a lot. I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun, and we'll hopefully do it again soon. So I will shut this off. That's a notice to you that you can start the recording, and thank you guys very much.